who's awesome, is helping out today. So we'll both kind of check the chat feed and feel free to ask questions as we go along. So my name's Holly Bell. I am the equity specialist for the Utah State Board of Education, and one of my responsibilities is Section 504, protecting students with disabilities from discrimination. And so some of you might know me already. Others, welcome to the 504 Club. It's basically the muddy version of IDEA. So you get IDEA, insert, unclarity. So that is, but you know what? It's become one of my favorite things to research and understand. So hopefully I can help you feel the same. So this training I put together because there are definitely considerations that have been taking place for students with disabilities on the 504 plan as we moved into soft closure. There's definitely considerations moving forward. So hopefully I've given you a good mix of things in the situation. I try to look at the big picture and think about what would be the most helpful. So let's move on to our objectives. Mercedes is sharing her screen, so she's going to help me with that. So we're going to talk about the priorities in the phases of recovery. I'll explain what those are as far as what the USBE has put forward as the priorities. We're going to do a quick review of 504 procedures and responsibilities, and then to hopefully give you some guidance and resources that you can use for remote learning. And we know with our 504 students, remote learning has been a thing in the past as far as providing accommodations. And I think there's been a lot of creative ways that people have used this type of remote learning in the past. So you might have been ahead of the game moving into this situation. And so it's something, even if we were to move back into the old normal, I think these are tools that we've learned to use that can really provide some benefit for our students. I think we've learned a lot. And then we'll see where we're maybe projecting forward for when normal operations resume. So let's talk about the USBE phases of recovery that they've put forward. We've been in phase 1, now we're moving on to phase 2 and 3. So these are the focuses. Right now we're looking at bridging the learning gaps that have occurred during this crisis, this soft closure. So we'll talk a little bit about federal funds that may be available. Yes, good news. At least my interpretation of the CARES Act is that you can finally use some federal funding for 504 students. Don't quote me on that per se, but I've talked with people at our agency. Definitely, you just want to leave this, you're going to want to have close communication with your district. But I just thought I'd like to give you some good news. Money for 504. And so assessments that we're using to determine gaps, providing some opportunities for students to have small group and individual tutoring, and just providing with things to catch up. Let's see what the gaps are. How can we help them catch up? And then we're projecting into the fall. We don't know what's going to happen in the fall. Everyone knows that. So we're going to look at the health and safety and the assessments, summative and formative assessments to find out where our kids are at. That's going to be especially critical with our 504 students, any of our students with disabilities, and any of the students in the vulnerable categories that already have difficulty accessing education. It's going to be particularly important to make sure that we have the tools that we need to assess those gaps. And just kind of continue on providing with what we've learned is useful for them. What's been working. Okay, next slide, please. So when we're talking about COVID, the priorities we want to focus on, overall, we really need to focus on the whole child. So what are the health and safety and welfare of students? So their emotional safety, mental health, there's a lot of impact, and this is going to impact how their disabilities are expressed, and how it affects their way of being able to access their education. And then engaging efforts with our families, because now we're putting them, they're in a position where they're trying to provide these supports that were maybe available in school. So really having good communication with them. And you're going to hear this term maximum extent possible. So when we're looking at what are the Fed looking at as far as how we're implementing our responsibilities under Section 504, it's were you providing FAPE to the maximum extent possible. So that's the language that they're using. And then document. I've always expressed document everything, especially when it comes down to civil rights. Document, and making sure it's focused, consistent, and it demonstrates the efforts that you made to serve them, to provide FAPE to the maximum extent possible. So those are the priorities. Next slide, please. Just a quick review what Section 504 is. It's a federal civil rights law under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So it prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in all school programs that receive federal funding. And 504 is designed to provide equal access and fairness in general education. It's a little different than special education. Moving on. Now, what is considered a disability under ADA is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And this is not just learning, this is communication, walking, sleeping, breathing, any of and all of those things that you would think, what I do every day. And what I do every day, if I can't eat, then I'm not going to be able to concentrate and access my education. So those are all major life activities. And if it's substantially limiting one or more of those, if they have a record of such an impairment. So I typically don't talk too much about records of impairment and being regarded as, because there are those that are technically eligible, but I don't typically talk a lot about that. It's more the eligibility process of number one. So we're going to talk a little bit about Child Find. Child Find is explicitly listed in IDEA. It's the, let's move on to the next slide. It's the responsibility to identify, locate, and evaluate students who might need services, who might potentially have a disability. So where it comes into play with 504 is in OCR findings and case law. So when we are because 504 doesn't have a lot of clarity, we get clarity from court case findings, and OCR. So a lot of the language that's used, we kind of like to get on the coattails of IDEA because it's best practices, but we're going off of the decisions made by the courts and OCR as far as what our guidelines ultimately are to follow. So Child Find has come up in case law as far as when schools have been negligent in finding and identifying, locating, and evaluating students who might need 504 accommodations. So it still applies now. So even when the students are not in our brick and mortar buildings, we need to be finding these kids. And it might look a little bit different because we're used to observing them in classrooms. We're used to a different atmosphere of Child Find. So some things to be thinking about right now is, who are our kids that fell off the grid? They weren't accessing online resources. We don't know where they went. And why is that? There's a reason behind it. Doesn't mean that they have an impairment, but let's ask those questions. Who are those students that really struggle more than others in using technology and And again, it doesn't mean that they have a disability, but those red flags can go off in your mind, and with your teachers, like asking your teachers, what students really struggled the most, needed extra support. And also, what data do you already have from past observation? You might already have kind of suspected some things with some students, as far as classroom observations and parents, what parents have reported. And you can add that in addition to what you've observed in the current situation. It might really add to what you already have. And what are parents saying? What are teachers observing? So child find is still in effect. So I want to talk a little bit more about evaluations during these times when we don't have students in our buildings, because they do need to be taken place. The same rule still applies that you have 45 school days. So at this point, you're not going to be doing evaluations. I mean, you might be gathering up some evidence. You might be talking amongst each other and saying, hey, what students really stood out to you? Just kind of the child find obligation, but we're out for the summer. You don't need to be doing evaluations, but looking for students you might need to, and you might have parents contacting you and requesting an evaluation when school starts. But when you do have these times of soft closure, or distance learning, you do need to conduct evaluations. And they can be done similarly to what they look like in IDEA. And it's the same thing where if you get into an evaluation situation and this child is new to you, either they are new to you as far as looking at them as a potential student who qualifies under Section 504, or new to the school entirely, you are going to do the same thing that you do in your typical evaluation as far as gathering evidence. That might be one of the things, is that you say, I don't have anything. I have my attendance records, I have parent report, I have whatever, maybe they've given me documents from a physician, maybe they have, but if you don't have any classroom observations or experience with the student in order to make a determination, just keep in mind that you've got those 45 days. You might be in a situation where you say, okay, well, we evaluated it. At this point, we can't make a determination, how do we want to proceed? Like, do we want to make a plan to move forward and do an evaluation? I know that under typical circumstances, the whole wait and see philosophy is not a good one to have. So that's why you just document your justification saying, we don't have enough evidence at this point. We want to do an evaluation. We will do it when we have, we return to school and we're able to gather more evidence. So I think it's just good faith efforts is really what you need to practice, but evaluation should take place because child find should trigger that. So that's the advice that I've been giving. There isn't any clear guidance on evaluations during remote learning, but it should never prevent the process. It just might look a little bit different. And when I talk about documenting, some of you may be familiar with the forms that I've put online on our website, and there's a link here, and I'll make sure that you all have access to the PowerPoint to whomever I'm going to submit that to. So there's a bunch of forms that you can still use. I made them fillable, which I'm glad I did because it makes it really convenient for you. But then when you get a parent signature, which electronic signature is fine, then, and just make sure they submit those to you through some kind of a secure server, because you want to remember FERPA, just being sensitive to confidentiality and how you're communicating with information that's sensitive information for a child. And so just a quick review of an evaluation process. This is a slide that I always use and it still applies. And we talked a little bit how it might look during closure, but it's getting parent consent. You do need parent consent. That just is always a requirement. There aren't a lot of requirements in 504, but that is one of them. Gathering the team, another requirement that they are knowledgeable of the child. So this can get a little tricky, especially if they're transitioning to another school. And they're moving one grade level to the next. As far as those determining the 504 plan, that's a brand new plan, having people who are knowledgeable of that child. So at least 3 people. I recommend including the parent, but by law, they're not required to be part of the team. But they have to be knowledgeable of the child, and I don't think you could justify anyone more knowledgeable of the child than the parent. And then gathering any data that you have, and you have to consider multiple sources. You can't just look at a doctor's recommendations, and that can put you in a really good place, because a lot of times parents will demand a 504 plan and say, I have the doctor says so, and you have to give it to me, and that's just not the case. And you can't require it of them either. You can't require any sort of data unless you want to pay the doctor bill. And then the evaluation period completed within 45 school days after getting the consent. You've got that 45-day window, and that's the same as IDEA. So here's just some examples of the forms that we have online. Just quickly go through these. You can see they're fillable. Next one. This is the consent form. So you see there's a checkbox from the, now you can download and adapt these. As you can see, I didn't put a parent signature line because I intended this to be a handwritten signature, but this is a form that you can use, and you can put in a box for an electronic signature. Feel free, you can change the information. I have no claim on these. So. And then you need to provide them with their procedural safeguards notice. This is just an example. You probably have your own. You're welcome to use your own. But this is the information that needs to be contained in the procedural safeguards. I hear parents, and I would post this on your websites, because when I get calls from parents all the time, I hear, no, I was never given my rights. I don't believe that that's always the case, because as a parent, I have my son's teachers give me things all the time that I don't read, and I tuck them away, or I don't know, I get things all the time. So I don't necessarily always believe that, but anytime, always give them their rights. Anytime that you're having communication, I would say, reminder of your rights, post it online. That way you're covered. Next slide. So when we're talking about eligibility for a 504 plan, we've talked about if it substantially limits one or more major life activities or bodily functions and impacts the student's education. So next slide. And here I go over major life activities. I'm going to go to my copy. Okay. Next slide. So let's say that you have a student that already has an existing plan. So I don't know if any of you know Julie Weatherly, but she's my idol. The fact that I have a 504 idol concerns me about my social life, but I recently watched a webinar from her, and she said, as far as your existing plans, you can leave them as is, or you can change them. She was kind of speculating on how much scrutiny there would be about what was done during this time of providing services for students with disabilities, and she was thinking very optimistically that as long as you're putting your good faith efforts, providing services to the maximum extent possible, that there will be a lot of leniency. So you can change it, you can leave it as is, but then when you return, you need to look at those plans. Now, I'm not saying have a follow-up meeting with all of the parents and so on. You're going to be up to your eyeballs in work to do. But I think it would be good to sit down and just look through your plans and maybe flag the ones that could potentially need revision. Maybe jot down observations that you made during closure that might potentially lead to revisions in their plan. And then eventually you might need to revise them and maybe bring the parent conversation. So I would just say review the plans and be watchful. It's going to take a minute for you to, you may be able to do assessments and things for gaps, but you might not have something that really will demonstrate those gaps until we've moved forward a little bit more with normal operations. Who knows when that will be, what that will look like? None of us know. Whoops, let's go back. So in the meantime, provide some multi-tiered systems of support. And if you have a document written existing, you can also write a separate document with parents to modify it during that time. If you're writing a new plan, it's not a bad idea to, or if you're going to modify an existing plan, it's not a bad idea to write in the plan, in the event of remote learning, here are the accommodations that will be made. So you've probably been doing some multi-tiered systems of support during this closure that you can say, this worked. We're going to put this in the plan that in the event of these are the accommodations that will be provided. Just a thought. We're all kind of just flying in blind in the night. So things I've been thinking. As far as transfer goes, so we're talking about students who might be going to the next level, elementary to middle school, people who transfer in from out of state, same thing applies. You're just going to put the current plan into place. It may have been changed during this time, may not have. So you just got to stick with the current plan you have until you meet and make a new one. So same processes. Okay, next slide. So here's some guidance that we got. I'm going to read this to you from the U.S. Department of Education. So, although federal law requires distance instruction to be accessible to students with disabilities, it does not mandate specific methodologies. Where technology itself imposes a barrier to access, or where educational materials simply are not available in an accessible format, educators may still meet their legal obligations by providing children with disabilities equally effective alternate access to the curriculum or services provided to other students. So, considering things such as distance instruction, teletherapy and teleintervention. So I've heard of physical therapy happening online, occupational therapy, things happening online that are available to students, considering, security of information. Meetings on digital platforms, online options for data tracking, documentation, and low-tech strategies for like curriculum-based resources, instructional packets, projects, written assignments, as long as you're providing support for those things. Then however we can get access to education for these students who have very personal, individualized needs, and that's what 504 is always stressing, is individualizing needs for the students, then we're putting forth our good faith effort, and it sounds like the U.S. Department of Education is giving us some flexibility with that. So some of this information kind of more applies to distance learning. You may end up needing this in the future, maybe not. So you just need to consider, and these are some things that all districts have been looking at, all teachers all educators have been looking at. Do they have access? Access is an issue to, the hardware, the software, the Wi-Fi. Is their Wi-Fi even capable of handling this type of learning? What are their cognitive, executive functioning needs and physical and sensory needs? And so we're asking all of these questions, but you need to put that all into context and figure out what all of these components are that you're working with each individual child. I just have to tell you, I've been super busy, but in the schools, and I just really idolize all of you for what you've been doing. This has been a huge task. Yeah, monumental. So, okay, let's move on. And then when you're looking at that infrastructure, you got to be looking at what your LEAs are providing, because there are limitations. We've got some funding on the way that we can use, but you've got a lot of different needs in the district. So make sure you know your protocols and your guidelines, and safety as far as training materials and that kind of thing, as far as your health and safety and theirs. So just make sure that you understand what is required. Okay, next one. And a lot of these things I borrowed from my special education friends, because and I'll show you some resources that they shared. It's always good practice if you can look to the IDEA and follow their guidelines. You don't have the same requirements like timelines and things like that, but there is no timeline for an evaluation period. We borrowed 45 days from Utah special education rules. Pretty much everything in 504 are guidelines. And so if you understand, I saw we have special education teacher. If you understand IDEA, 504 is not as strict, but they're good guidelines. So I'm very concerned personally, and I know a lot of people are concerned about the social and emotional health of students right now and moving into the future. I mean, I'm worried about discrimination in the current climate. Probably not so much direct at 504, but Title VI. But anyway, so what are we going to do to keep them engaged and keep them their social emotional health? So moving on. And these are some things that probably just tuck into your back pocket. Looking at some of if we were to go into remote learning again, these are some things that were suggested by Kim Fratto on one of her slides. If you know her, she works in our special education department. Very smart lady. So here's just some things some options to think about when you're working remotely with students. Next slide, please. So I did some research with WestEd. WestEd has been really supportive for us in offering resources and things, and so they have provided a document, and I've got a link to it in my resources. But there are tons of great communication apps that you can use to keep in touch with students. And I love the Talking Points app as far as you have sending home messages in multiple languages, and they can, and it translates. So this is a great resource. I wish I could, I was going to share my screen and click on wordify.com for you, but I won't have you do it, Mercedes, but it's so fun. Like, I recommend you try it. I couldn't believe it. It blew my mind. So like you have a kind of a complicated website. If you have something for parents that can be a little bit complicated, and maybe we're not talking about non-native English speakers, but I put in one of the case laws for something, and then I put the link to that URL in Rewordify, and it like totally changed the wording so it made more sense. It blew my mind. It like highlights everything in yellow that it changed. So that's something that I was not aware of. That's really cool as far as accessibility goes. If you can make language and law accessible, that's like a miracle. So some other online resources, these are specific to working with I mean, not necessarily always specific to kids with disabilities, but anything that can make online learning more accessible and motivate our students to engage in learning. Because I think our students with disabilities, in general, they're more frustrated with accessing their education. And so then when they've got this thrown at them, this whole new system of learning, it can be very frustrating, but we can make it fun. I'm sure you heard a lot about just kind of shortening the school day and not having, you know, focusing more on competency and just chunking assignments and demonstrating different ways of competency. And so that can enhance learning, and especially for our students with disabilities, that we just want to keep them engaged. So here's some others. Or for our ADHD kids down there. Okay, so I think I talked about most of this, about when school resumes, whatever that looks like. And so you might consider using some informal assessments or screenings. And you know, these are things that you could possibly do screenings and assessments remotely too. I'm not going to recommend any per se, because I would just say, especially with mental health screenings and things like that, consult with your special education director, maybe your school psychologist. I don't want to guide you with anything that wouldn't be good quality information and data that you get from those assessments. But when they come back, it would be good if you do have any assessments to see where we've had a disruption in learning. Let's see, reviewing them. I think as far as predicting forward in the future, and I know that last bullet, you're already seeing it, you might have a little panic attack, but we need to watch for mental health impairments. I think that's going to be huge, and it already has been. So I do have the webinar on USB website on anxiety, supporting students with anxiety, under Section 504. So that's on my educational equity webpage, which I believe I have linked on this email or on this presentation. And so we're going to be looking for things like that. But remember that it's going to take a little time to assess. All of us are going to have a transition period. You're going to be looking for the mental well-being of your staff too. It's going to be an adjustment. All of this is an adjustment, and we've all got some anxiety, and I feel like I'm stuck in the house, and often I feel low. It's I miss social interaction, and if you think about our kids, that their friends mean the world to them, and they might come back a little depressed. So gauging whether or not it's substantially impacting them might take a little time. So be patient with parents that are saying, you know, my child is really struggling right now with anxiety. We don't know yet if it is an impairment that qualifies under Section 504. Don't dismiss it, but you might need to give it a little adjustment period. So I'm just predicting the future with my little crystal ball that doesn't always work. And I've heard conversations going that service animals might be a thing. They become more and more of a thing. And it's a tricky one. And we have good guidelines on the State Board of Education as far as service animals are concerned. You know, people have been at home with their pets and they're feeling anxious because they can't be around their friends, but Fido has been a great comfort, and well, their child is scared to go back to school without Fido, and so we're just going to take a deep breath here and hope for the best. But I want to remind you of the two questions you can answer. So is this dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? So you cannot ask for training papers. All you can ask is if it's required for disability, And this is under ADA. You have to let the animal in the school. If it's required for a disability, you can't even ask what the disability is. You know, you might, as a child with a service animal might not need 504 services. Most likely, they will need a 504 plan. But you can't ask what the disability is. It's just, is it required? And what task does it perform? That's all you can ask. So, and it doesn't matter if it's a pit bull. I'm not kidding you. These are the questions that I get. It doesn't matter. Okay. And then just making decisions moving forward, just make sure that you're gathering your evidence. What accommodations with an alternative method did they receive? Did they work? So were they beneficial? Were they used before? What was their level of engagement and their ability to access the services? Were they confused constantly about this application or using this technology? Do you have documentation of the amount of services that were provided, and as specific as you can get? I'd hate to think that we'd have, like, off the bat, this being, you know, the initial period of time that we're trying to adjust to this, that you're going to have OCR come in and say, well, look at what you didn't do. If you're practicing deliberate indifference, that's another thing. But I mean, as much as you can document, you know, this child was not engaging in online education. We contacted parents on this day. We sent a letter, da, da, da. And then kind of what percentage did they receive the accommodations? What's the indication of regression, level of regression, or loss of skills? And are there other needs that came into play? So there might be some mental health needs that will be incorporated into a current plan. And again, that's going to take a little time and assessment tools and things. Okay, so remember I said, congratulations, there's funding you can use for 504. Now, like I said, don't necessarily quote me on that. I read the CARES Act guidance pretty thoroughly and asked other people questions. You know, when they say students with disabilities, that can be applied with CARES Act funding. It doesn't specifically say students with an IEP. So but it's not up to me how that CARES Act funding is spent. It's up to LEA leadership. And it's going to have to be dispersed there's a lot of needs. And I had questions about translation services from someone, I think in a charter school. And I believe through reading it that you can use this for translation with the CARES Act funding. And as far as the ones that we recommend, I've provided the link of translation services. And then mental health supports, CARES Act does cover that. And then I don't know if you're aware of the elementary school counselor grant program. And then this last legislative session, there's the school-based mental health qualified grant program. So that can provide you with resources to hire staff, just a number of things that you can use to serve students' mental health needs. Okay, so just keeping in mind, a lot of times when we talk about remote learning, we consider it a change of placement. It's not considered a change of placement because it wasn't a decision by the school. It was health and safety emergency. Always keeping in mind the Federal Education Rights to Privacy Act, documenting everything, and those are some suggestions of things to document. Implementing the existing plan when normal school operations resume. That's the language out of the document from last May 21st. And just practice a reasonable period of time in making these determinations. And regarding the impact, regarding the eligibility, and then take a look and have conversations. I'm sure you're already having these conversations where you're sitting down and you're saying, okay, what worked for our students with disabilities? So what can we do better in the future? pat yourselves on the back because you've done a really good job. I've heard great things, and just a plan moving forward, because we know people are predicting that this might happen again. I mean, there's going to be so many different configurations in education. I personally think it will change forever. And I think in some ways we've improved in a lot of different learning opportunities for students. So let's look at that. Let's capitalize on the things that we've learned that are working well, and you integrate those into some of our potential accommodations in the future, and ultimately prioritizing health and safety. So we focus a lot on learning gaps in learning, catching them up academically, but if we don't look at the whole child, if we're not addressing their basic emotional well-being and health, they're not going to engage in learning. So that's something I personally, I've heard others speak about prioritizing. So here are some resources. Utah Parent Center is fabulous. That's something you can let parents know about. So that WestEd, when I talked about a lot of those online resources that I found, was on this. WestEd provides a lot of great resources specific to COVID as well. And this link here is for that document where I got a lot of those online resources. And I think I have another resource page. I know I do. We've got a great page on the USBE website on MTSS. I'd encourage you to, there's so much information on there. I didn't provide any one thing. And then some other guidance from the Utah or the US Department of Education. So I've referred to the one on March 21st, and then I've also referred to the one in December of 2016. So there's my contact information. I have a lot of resources. Those forms that I talked about are on the link to the Educational Equity webpage. The one at the bottom is for my listserv. I think originally it was for coordinators, Bio4 coordinators, but pretty much anyone and everyone has signed up now. And so any information, I'll send this PowerPoint, this presentation out on that listserv. So sign up, it's really easy. You click on the link and put your name and email, as far as I know, that I remember. But I know it's super fast and easy. And then you can get anything that I send out as far as supporting students on a 504. I do webinars and a lot of different things. So I'm going to do a webinar on dyslexia and dysgraphia at some point. And I didn't get to do one on discipline of students with disabilities. So trying to plan on those things in the future. And there are a lot of webinars on there. There's supporting students with concussions, with ADHD, with diabetes, just kind of your basics of 504. I think that covers it. But do you have any questions at this point that have popped up? I haven't seen anything in the chat feed. Remote presentations actually make you get through the slides faster, I found, because people don't want to